Welcome to a deep dive into the Rwandan genocide. You've given us some fascinating source material here, and we're ready to unpack it all together. It's a complex event, and frankly, horrifying, but understanding how it all happened is crucial, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I mean, what happened in
Yeah.
Rwanda, it wasn't just like a spontaneous eruption of violence.
Right.
It was the culmination of decades, simmering tensions, power struggles, and just calculated manipulation.
Okay, so let's start with the groundwork. You've included some pieces on Belgian colonialism in the source material.
Right.
And I have to admit, the way they exerted control in Rwanda was unsettling, to say the least.
It's a crucial piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
The Belgians, when they came to Rwanda, didn't just govern,
Right.
They actively deepened the divisions between the Hutu and Tutsi populations. Imagine this.
Yeah.
They actually issued identity cards that classified people based on ethnicity,
Wow.
further solidifying these categories.
It's almost like they imposed a hierarchy where one didn't necessarily exist before.
Yeah.
Did this directly contribute to the resentment that fueled the genocide later on?
It certainly played a significant role by favoring the Tutsis, granting them, privileged access to education and positions of power. The Belgians inadvertently sowed the seeds of deep resentment among the Hutu majority.
That makes sense. I'm seeing that reflected in some of these historical accounts you've provided. It's like a pressure cooker waiting to explode.
And exploded did.
Yeah.
In 1959, the Hutu Revolution erupted, forcing hundreds of thousands of Tutsis to flee their homes and seek refuge in neighboring countries. And this event marked a turning point, further cementing the Hutu grip on power, but also deepening that chasm between the two groups.
Yeah. Reading about the trauma of displacement, the loss of homes, the families torn apart, it's heartbreaking. It feels like this event set the stage for further conflict.
Precisely. The scars of that Hutu revolution, they ran deep, and the conflict reignited with a vengeance in 1990 when the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, invaded from neighboring Uganda.
Ah, yes, the RPF, largely comprised of Tutsi refugees who had been exiled for decades. It's almost Shakespearean, this generation, fighting for their right to return to the land their parents were forced to flee.
It's a powerful image.
Yeah.
But the situation was far from black and white. While the RPF was fighting to reclaim their homeland, their invasion triggered a wave of fear and violence within Rwanda, leading to further massacres of Tutsis.
That's where the narrative gets really complicated. You mentioned in your notes that you were interested in the RPF's motivations. Some sources paint them as liberators, while others accuse them of human rights violations during the conflict. How do we reconcile these differing perspectives?
It's crucial to acknowledge that every conflict has layers of complexity.
Yeah.
The RPF, while fighting for a just cause, were also operating within a chaotic and brutal environment. Their actions, just like those of the Hutu extremists, must be examined within the broader context of the conflict.
So it's not about assigning simple labels of good and bad, but rather understanding the nuances of their actions within this incredibly volatile situation.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that history is rarely straightforward.
Okay, so we have this backdrop of simmering tension, escalating violence, and deep-seated resentment. But then a glimmer of hope emerges with the Arusha Peace Accords in 1993. Tell me more about that.
The Arusha Accords were, at least on paper, a monumental achievement. After years of conflict, Hutu and Tutsi leaders came together, negotiated, and ultimately signed an agreement that promised power sharing, a new constitution, and a path towards reconciliation.
It sounds like a true turning point, a
Yeah.
chance to finally bridge the divide. What happened? Why didn't it work?
Well, you have to remember that not everyone wanted peace. The Arusha Accords were met with fierce resistance, particularly from Hutu extremist groups who saw any power sharing as a threat to their dominance.
Right.
They began to actively undermine the peace process, spreading propaganda and stoking fear among the Hutu population.
So beneath the surface of this fragile peace agreement, there was a current of extremism that was about to erupt.
Exactly. And that brings us to the pivotal event that shattered the fragile peace and triggered the genocide: the assassination of President Juvenal Habyarimana on April 6, 1994.
The assassination. It feels like everything we've been talking about, the colonial legacy, the revolution, the invasion, all led to this flashpoint.
You could say that. Habyarimana, a Hutu, was considered a moderate, and his death created a power vacuum that the Hutu extremists were all too ready to exploit.
So within hours of the president's plane being shot down, the carefully constructed peace accords were essentially worthless.
Essentially, yes. The Hutu extremist groups, the Interahamwe and Impuzamugambi, wasted no time. They seized control of the radio, spewing hate-filled propaganda that blamed the Tutsis for the president's death and called for their extermination.
It's chilling how quickly they were able to mobilize and incite such widespread violence.
The speed and brutality were shocking. Roadblocks were erected across the country, and Tutsis, along with any Hutu who dared to oppose the killings, were systematically targeted and slaughtered.
One of the sources you provided mentions the murder of Prime Minister Agath Uwilingiyimana, a moderate Hutu, just days after the president's assassination. It's a horrifying detail that highlights the ruthlessness of the perpetrators.
It sent a clear message. No one who stood in their way would be spared. Even the 10 Belgian peacekeepers assigned to protect the prime minister were brutally murdered. The genocide had begun.
It's hard to fathom the scale of the violence that unfolded in those first few days. You mentioned in your notes that you wanted to explore how seemingly ordinary people were transformed into perpetrators of such horrific acts. Do the sources offer any insight into that?
It's a question that haunts anyone who studies genocide. And the Rwandan case is particularly chilling because the killings were often carried out face-to-face, using machetes, clubs, even farming tools. This wasn't a distant mechanized form of violence. It was deeply personal and intimate.
That detail about the tools, it sends shivers down my spine. It speaks to a level of dehumanization that's almost unimaginable.
Precisely. And the sources you provided shed light on the factors that contributed to this breakdown of morality. The relentless propaganda, the constant fear-mongering, the social pressure to conform, it all created an environment where violence became normalized, even encouraged.
Yeah, one of the articles you shared talks about the role of local officials who were often coerced or threatened into participating in the genocide. It wasn't just a handful of extremists driving this. It was a system of complicity that spread throughout society.
That's an important point. The genocide wasn't just a top-down phenomenon. It required the participation of ordinary people at every level.
Right.
Some were true believers driven by hatred and fear, while others were coerced, threatened, or simply caught up in the frenzy of the violence.
It makes you wonder, what would I have done in that situation? Would I have had the courage to resist, or would I have succumbed to the pressure? It's a sobering thought.
It's a question we all need to grapple with. The Rwandan genocide reminds us that the line between good and evil is often more permeable than we'd like to believe.
Okay, so while this horrific violence was unfolding, the world was watching, or rather not watching closely enough, it seems. Your sources paint a pretty damning picture of the international community's response, or lack thereof.
The world's failure to act decisively in Rwanda is a stain on our collective conscience. While there were individuals who risked their lives to save others, the overall response from governments and international organizations was woefully inadequate.
You specifically mention wanting to understand why the UN peacekeepers withdrew during the genocide. That seems utterly incomprehensible, abandoning those in need at the moment of greatest peril.
The UN peacekeeping force in Rwanda, UNAMIR, was severely understaffed and under-equipped from the start. They were operating under a limited mandate that restricted their ability to intervene in the escalating violence. And tragically, when the genocide began, the UN Security Council actually voted to reduce the number of peacekeepers, citing concerns for their safety and a lack of political will to engage in what was deemed an internal conflict.
It's almost as if the world was turning a blind eye to the unfolding horror, prioritizing political expediency over human lives.
That's a harsh assessment, but there's a painful truth to it. The Rwandan genocide exposed a deep flaw in the international system. A reluctance to intervene in situations that are deemed too complex, too risky, or simply too far removed from the interests of powerful nations.
One of your sources includes a powerful quote from former UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali, who later admitted, "The international community failed Rwanda." It's a stark admission of guilt, but does it offer any solace to the victims and survivors?
Apologies, however sincere, can't erase the pain and loss. But acknowledging the failure is a necessary first step towards preventing future atrocities. The question is, have we learned the lessons of Rwanda? Are we willing to act more decisively when faced with similar situations today?
You mentioned France's intervention, Operation Turquoise. Some sources argue that it saved lives, while others claim it was more about protecting France's interests in the region and even allowed some perpetrators to escape. How do we reconcile these conflicting views?
Operation Turquoise remains a controversial chapter in the history of the Rwandan genocide.
Yeah.
While there's no doubt that French troops did provide refuge for some Tutsis, the timing and motivations of the intervention raised serious questions. France had a long-standing relationship with the Hutu-led government and had been providing them with military support prior to the genocide.
So it's difficult to disentangle humanitarian intentions from geopolitical calculations in this case.
Exactly. And the fact that some perpetrators were able to escape into the French-controlled zone adds another layer of complexity to the narrative.
Hmm.
It highlights the challenges of intervening in a conflict where there are no easy answers, where the lines between victim and perpetrator are often blurred.
So the genocide ends, the RPF takes control, and Rwanda is left to pick up the pieces. What happened next? How do you even begin to rebuild a nation after such unimaginable trauma?
Rwanda's journey in the aftermath of the genocide has been one of both remarkable resilience and agonizing difficulty. The new government, led by the RPF's Paul Kagame, faced a monumental task: rebuilding infrastructure, restoring social order, and perhaps most importantly, seeking justice for the victims while fostering reconciliation between Hutus and Tutsis.
Justice and reconciliation seem like almost impossible goals in a society so deeply fractured by violence. What approach did they take?
Rwanda's approach to justice has been multifaceted and, in some ways, unprecedented. They established the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, or ICTR, to prosecute high-level perpetrators of the genocide. This was a landmark moment, the first international tribunal since Nuremberg to deliver convictions for the crime of genocide.
That must have been incredibly significant, sending a message that even those in positions of power would be held accountable for their crimes.
It was a powerful symbol of justice. But the ICTR could only handle a limited number of cases. To address the sheer scale of the crimes committed, Rwanda also implemented a system of community-based courts known as Gacaca.
Ah, yes, Kakaka. You mentioned that you were particularly interested in the use of these courts. What made them so unique, and what were the arguments for and against their implementation?
The Gacaca courts were designed to address the massive backlog of cases related to the genocide. Instead of relying solely on formal legal proceedings, they brought justice closer to the communities where the crimes had occurred. Perpetrators were encouraged to confess their crimes, seek forgiveness, and receive reduced sentences.
It sounds like a risky strategy,
No.
potentially prioritizing reconciliation over full accountability. Did it work?
The Gacaca courts were both praised and criticized. Supporters argued that they helped to break the cycle of violence, facilitated community healing, and provided a sense of closure for victims. They allowed for a more localized and nuanced understanding of the events, taking into account the specific circumstances and pressures that led individuals to participate in the killings.
And the criticisms.
Critics argued that the Gacaca courts lacked due process protections and could be susceptible to local power dynamics and personal vendettas. They worried that the emphasis on confession and forgiveness might overshadow the need for full accountability and justice.
So it sounds like a complex legacy, a bold experiment in transitional justice that had both positive and negative consequences.
Precisely. And it's a reminder that there are no easy answers when it comes to dealing with the aftermath of mass violence. Rwanda's approach was innovative, but it also came with its own set of challenges and limitations.
It feels like we've only just scratched the surface of this complex and multifaceted event. We've talked about the historical roots of the conflict, the shocking speed and brutality of the genocide itself, and the international community's failures to intervene effectively. We've also touched on the challenges of seeking justice and pursuing reconciliation in the aftermath of such unimaginable horror.
And yet there's still so much to unpack.
Yeah.
The Rwandan genocide raises profound questions about human nature, the fragility of peace, and the responsibilities we all bear in preventing such atrocities from happening again.
It's a heavy weight to carry, but I think that's one of the key takeaways from this deep dive. The recognition that we can't afford to be passive observers of history. We have to be actively engaged in understanding the forces that lead to violence
Yeah,
and working to build a more just and equitable world.
absolutely.
Uh,
I mean, the Rwandan genocide wasn't an isolated incident. It was a product of specific historical circumstances. But it also reflects these patterns of prejudice, discrimination, and dehumanization that we see playing out in different forms all over the world.
You mentioned earlier that you were particularly interested in the role of the media in inciting violence. Several of the sources you provided highlight how radio broadcasts were used to spread hate speech, demonize the Tutsi population, and create this atmosphere of fear and paranoia.
The power of propaganda is a chilling reminder that words can be weapons. In Rwanda, radio became a tool for inciting hatred and mobilizing people to commit acts of unspeakable violence. It's a stark lesson in the importance of media literacy, critical thinking, and the need to challenge misinformation and hate speech wherever we encounter it.
It's a reminder that the fight against genocide doesn't begin and end with military intervention. It requires a sustained effort to combat prejudice and intolerance at all levels of society, starting with ourselves and our own communities.
One of the articles you shared talks about the concept of moral courage, the willingness to speak out against injustice, even when it's difficult or dangerous.
Right.
In the context of the Rwandan genocide, there were individuals, Hutus, who risked their lives to shelter Tutsis, journalists who refused to spread hate propaganda, even UN officials who tried to raise the alarm about the impending violence.
Those stories of individual courage are incredibly inspiring, but they also highlight the immense pressure and danger that those who resisted faced. It makes you wonder, what can we do in our own lives to cultivate that kind of moral courage, to be prepared to act when faced with injustice?
Well, it starts with recognizing that we all have a role to play.
Hmm.
It's about educating ourselves about the history of genocide, you know, and the warning signs of mass violence. It's about challenging prejudice and discrimination in our own circles, even when it's uncomfortable. And it's about supporting organizations that are working to promote human rights and prevent atrocities.
So it's not just about knowing the facts of the Rwandan genocide. It's about internalizing the lessons and applying them to our own lives, our own communities, and our own world.
Precisely. The Rwandan genocide was a tragedy of immense proportions, but it also offers a powerful opportunity for learning and growth. It reminds us that we can't afford to be complacent. We have to be vigilant in defending human rights, promoting tolerance, and building a world where such horrors are never repeated.
This has been a truly insightful and thought-provoking deep dive. We've explored the complexities of the Rwandan genocide from its historical roots to its lasting impact. We've grappled with challenging questions about human nature, the failures of the international community, and the difficult path towards justice and reconciliation.
It's a story that stays with you long after you've learned the facts. It's a story that demands reflection, action, and a commitment to building a better future.
Well, you've provided us with some incredibly valuable source material, and I hope this deep dive has equipped you with a deeper understanding of this complex and tragic event. But more importantly, I hope it has inspired you to continue exploring this topic, to challenge your own assumptions, and to find ways to contribute to a world where genocide is truly a thing of the past.